Taj of the Beat.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, guys, gals, and non-binary pals to another episode of All the Above, the show that gives you an unstandardized take on education. I'm Jeffrey Garrett, one of your co-hosts, and I've been a middle and high school principal and a high school social studies teacher. And as always, I'm joined by...
What up, family? It's Manuel, your favorite teacher's favorite teacher. I'm a high school history teacher in the Los Angeles area. This is year 17 in the classroom for me, and this here, of course, is All the Above, your place for news and analysis of all things related to the world of education. We want to shout out everybody watching us on YouTube or listening to us on the go. And Jeff, I would be remiss if I did not point out that this episode is dropping about 1 year since we left our physical in-person studio. It's been about 1 full year since the coronavirus lockdown closed all the physical school buildings across the country. And well, so much has happened in that year. And a lot of y'all discovered our show over the course of that year because some of you, of course, were, like so many teachers, struggling to sort of reassess and reevaluate your place in this profession, given all the uncertainty of the pandemic. And some of you went searching for podcasts like ours or shows like ours to gain broader perspective. And we also saw an uptick in viewership and listenership during the summer after or in the wake of the reckoning for racial justice across the United States. And we saw a lot of educators search out shows like ours to learn more and to be part of these really dope conversations, these critical conversations that we have here on All of the Above. So we just want to shout out everybody for just hanging in there through the midst of just what has been an unimaginable time in education. Thank you for being here with us, and we're gonna continue to do what we can to fight for educational justice for all of our young folks, despite whatever pandemic, whatever politics, whatever challenges might lie ahead.
Yeah, man, 1 year. It's incredible. It's hard to conceive of, man. And funny enough, I think you were like the last person in my life that I like really know who I saw before going into the quarantine.
Lucky you, man.
Yeah, we filmed that episode with Travis Bristol and Misha Mosley on that Saturday when the lockdown went into effect in California. Back before we were like, is it really bad? I don't,
man.
What should we do? And that was it. That was the end, right? So, man, it's hard to believe it's been a full year at this point. But, vaccines are coming. And hopefully we can, adjust to something better than this soon.
Indeed. Absolutely. So, Jeff, we have kept the show on the road despite the closure of our normal studio. Thanks to the support of a lot of our listeners, a lot of our viewers, we've been able to finance a home studio setup, and we're going to keep it moving as always. So, Jeff, what is on the agenda for today's episode?
Well, Manuel, as usual, we got a good one for folks today, and I'm excited for this episode because, we are both people who have a secondary background, right? And I think we often tend to start our conversations looking through the lens of secondary teachers, right? We do our best to kind of talk about higher ed and talk about early ed and elementary as well, but it's fair to say we haven't had a ton of elementary voices on the show, and we're gonna do something about that today. We are bringing on a teacher, Meghann Seril, who's a elementary teacher in Los Angeles. She has been a teacher leader for a number of years. She has been active in her union, United Teachers of Los Angeles. And in this kind of day and age where the questions about reopening school and starting with elementary school, at least here in California and here in LA, starting with elementary school, are kind of on everyone's mind, right? And where I think there's some broad consensus that, the significance of missing a year of school for, say, a first grader compared to, say, a 10th grader, is a different thing. Meghann's going to help us kind of get into some of these issues, right? About how pandemic schooling has impacted elementary students and teachers, and looking forward into this kind of debate about when and how to reopen schools, especially for our youngest learners. So it's going to be a good one. You definitely don't want to miss it.
Yes, indeed. She is so dope. I'm so excited. This is going to be great. All right, folks. But up first, we have our Do Now, where we take a look at recent headlines in the world of education. All right, stay tuned. All right, folks. It's time for today's Do Now. Jeff, how are we going to do the Do Now today?
Manuel, today we have the distinct privilege, in the spirit of policy from our federal government, of doing some testing, Manuel. So we got a pop quiz for you today. We're gonna do a little assessment.
All right, pop quiz. Cameras on, students. Surveillance state. We got to make sure nobody else is in the room when you take the test.
God.
All that.
All that.
All right, Jeff. So here's the first question for today's pop quiz. Who wins in a fight? The pandemic or the school to prison pipeline?
Ooh. Wow. I mean, school to prison pipeline is powerful, but I think I'm gonna go with the pandemic, man. Well, I mean, pandemic affects the whole world, right? So I'm going COVID-19 for the win.
Yeah, well, the pandemic has certainly packed a punch, and it looks like the pandemic is winning this round. However, the school to prison pipeline is not to be counted out, and it looks like the school to prison pipeline is poised for a rematch and perhaps revenge, according to this article, which we drew from the Hechinger Report. And we just want to take a moment to shout out the Hechinger Report, a great source for education news. So if you are somebody who is interested in these issues in education and you don't already read up on the Hechinger Report, then we highly suggest you do that. This is not a paid ad or sponsorship or anything like that. Although we wouldn't be against that if that meets anybody's fancy. In any case, this story we get from Hechinger Report from some great reporting by Carolyn Preston and Sarah Butrimowicz. And they report that when it comes to school discipline, this school year has introduced a host of never-before-seen disciplinary infractions. Records from one district in Florida indicate that roughly 11% of disciplinary incidents were in some way related to the coronavirus pandemic and the district's new requirements for in-person and virtual instruction. Students removed their masks, chatted inappropriately in Zoom, and failed to socially distance. And in this article, they report that over the course of just one school day last fall, a middle schooler received an in-school suspension for ripping off another student's face mask and blowing into a peer's face. 6 other students across the district were written up for not wearing their masks correctly, including one student who faked using hand sanitizer. An elementary student was assigned 3 days of quote-unquote private dining for sharing food in violation of safety guidelines, and an e-learning student got in trouble for filming another student during class without permission. School discipline during the pandemic has been confounding for many teachers, with few having received much guidance from administrators on how to handle discipline issues, whether in the virtual learning environment or in the new COVID-minded physical learning environment. But at the same time, in some districts, the number of students being referred to the justice system by school administrators has fallen, prompting advocates and lawyers to wonder if schools will permanently reconsider their role in criminalizing student behavior and contributing to the school to prison pipeline. There is concern, however, that if students don't receive adequate counseling and other support to cope with the emotional challenges exacerbated by this pandemic, there might be a surge in behavioral issues and punitive discipline when more children return to the actual physical classroom. Dan Lawson, who's the director for the Center for Civil Rights Remedies at UCLA's Civil Rights Project, is quoted as saying, "I predict there will be a train wreck if we don't staff up and provide the services, especially mental health services, to all the kids who may need them." So, Jeff, it looks like as far as those criminalizing behaviors by way of school discipline, those are down this year during the pandemic. But there is concern that when this pandemic is over, we're going to see a surge in that sort of really, really tough discipline that we saw contributing to the school to prison pipeline for all these years. So there's a lot going on here, Jeff. I'm wondering what your thoughts are around discipline amidst this pandemic.
Yeah, Manuel, this is one of those stories that actually leaves me with like more questions, I think, than answers, because honestly, in a virtual context, I'm trying to picture like what a student could do that would result in a suspension, right? I mean, I guess there's maybe this sort of Zoom bombing scenario or something, right? I don't know, maybe that's it, but I'm just trying to imagine like how turning on your camera or not turning on your camera or muting or unmuting, like how like what do you control in in the classroom space that you could, theoretically use in some way that would warrant a suspension? And I'm like, I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine that, honestly. And I can, there's all kinds of like inappropriate things that could happen, right? Saying negative stuff in the chat or whatever, right? But that just warrants a different type of response, right? Like you talk to the kids, you talk about what's the expectations of the community and why you build community. You respond to that in a different way than with a suspension. So, on the one hand, I guess I'm saying like, I'm glad this data is going down, and I sure hope it would go down since so many kids aren't actually in school most of the time right now. So that's good. But also, there's something about this to me that just feels like, shouldn't it have dropped way more than than it has? And maybe I just, need to do a deeper analysis. But it rings to me as like, if we're finding ways to still suspend or involve police in kids' learning experience that's hybrid or distance learning, we are seeking a problem and finding ways to criminalize kids that just like we need to stop immediately.
Right. Yeah. Early on in the school year, there were several incidents where teachers found ways to get students suspended despite being in a virtual learning environment. There was a kid, I think it was Colorado, who was suspended for having, a BB gun in the background. And in Louisiana, some kid received a 6-day suspension from school because he had a BB gun on his bed or something behind him, which is crazy. So there was some of that early on in the school year, I think. But in terms of more recently, somebody in the article mentioned that it's kind of hard to tell right now because it's easier for certain teachers to discipline students and not have to write it up in quiet ways, such as not allowing a student to unmute themselves or not allowing a student to log into class or removing a student from the Zoom environment. Whereas before that might have taken like paperwork and send the kid to the office. Now a teacher could just with one click remove the student and keep it pushing. So, removal is removal, whether it's physical or not. So there is that. But, the article did point out that in terms of referrals to police, that has been way down. I think they talked about Miami-Dade County in particular, and how usually each year there's dozens and dozens of students who are referred to the police department. And this year there's been, I think it was like 5 or some single digit number, which is great. But it's kind of like, to your point, like, well, yeah, it should be down that low. And why are there any in this case referrals to police? So, some, I think, wonder whether or not this whole experience during this pandemic and our so-called reimagining of education and reflecting and doing some inner work might result in hopefully a more humanizing approach to school discipline when we are fully in person. I do not expect that to happen, however, because we educators are so overburdened with these conversations around returning to physical school, standardized testing, and just like all the usual stuff that like, I don't know how much teachers are actually being supported and prepared for envisioning a full return to in-person and thinking about discipline in a different way. Like those conversations, I don't think are happening at all. So the person in the article from UCLA who said like he's worried that there's going to be a surge of discipline incidents when we fully return back to in-person. Yeah, I can totally see that. And I'm worried as well. And not because students have gone this year without as much access to counselors and social workers and the type of supports that they might need. I'm worried that teachers, a lot of teachers, especially those of us who have been virtual this whole time, returning back to the classroom, I think there's going to be it's going to be a rough transition for a lot of folks, and getting back into that world of having a room full of students and having to navigate the different challenges of that. Yeah, I'm worried that a lot of teachers are just going to go with the old school, like, nope, can't be in here, got to go. On top of the fact that there's going to be all these new rules around, social distancing and all these things, all these new ways to discipline students that you might already have a grudge against as a terrible teacher, So, yeah, man, I'm a little worried. We'll see where this goes, but I have lost hope. I'm sorry to say, I have lost hope for a reimagining of education taking place. As soon as we started hearing those calls for standardized testing and all this pressure to reopen like quickly, I realized, you know what, that whole reimagining business, it seems like that part is done. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like your skepticism is warranted. I don't think I would say I have lost hope. But I would say the writing on the wall is not good. Right?
Yeah.
And, honestly, something, Manuel, that the article talked about that I hadn't really thought a whole lot about in a while, because we've been in distance learning all year here in LA, is the sort of new disciplinary infractions that result from a hybrid context where kids have to walk on a certain path to maintain social distance, or,
right.
Of course there's mask wearing requirements and, hand washing and a certain number of people allowed in the bathroom or, at a time and those sorts of things. Right. And the very righteous, I'm not saying we shouldn't have very clear procedures and rules around, how to keep everyone safe. We should. But the question then arises, right? So what do we do if a kid is not abiding by those rules, right? And it's not a joke, right? It's not a game in terms of the risk that could pose to others. So, I think that actually puts us in a spot where there's potentially, this kind of really unfortunate combination of the pre-existing inertia of the system that we know has lots of racism and racial bias built in, right? With a new sense of urgency around upholding the rules, right, for everyone's safety, and very real risk of not following those rules, right? And that could be a situation that is, and I guess also mixing in there, right, the just sort of normal childhood behaviors of flirting around and seeing what you can get away with the rules, right?
Yeah.
So, that combination could prove to be really unfortunate in terms of how it plays out in the lives and the lived experience of some of our already most marginalized kids in school. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out here in LA. And I think it's probably going to take some real intentional work on the part of schools and educators to not have this turn into a COVID version of the line of black boys outside the principal's office, right? And I hope we're ready for that.
Man, I hope so too. For too many students, school already felt a lot like a prison. And with more rules, especially rules around physical spacing, it might feel even more like a prison for certain students and depending on the climate and culture of the school, for sure. So yeah, we need to have those humanizing conversations right now before it's too late and before we see a growth of this school to prison pipeline. So yeah. So all right, Jeff, what's the next question for today's pop quiz?
All right, Manuel. The next up is, what's 13% of GDP in the United States and disproportionately hurts black, brown, and poor folk?
There's a lot of possibilities there, Jeff, because there's a lot of things that disproportionately hurt black, brown, and indigenous folks. But I'm going to have to go with maybe private prisons, the amount of money we spend on private prisons. Is that what we're talking about here, Jeff?
You know what, Manuel, the beauty of this question and the beauty of this answer is this is America. And so whatever you picked is correct. Whatever you picked.
Pretty
if you had said cucumbers, it probably would have been right. We could have found a way.
Man, food deserts in the hood,
right.
People not getting access to cucumbers. Yes, man.
Yes, and of course, private prisons, 100% correct. Although I don't know if we spend 13%.
I don't know if 13% is the right,
private
but
prisons.
Yeah.
We do prisons like nobody else, but I don't know that we're spending that much on prisons.
Right.
The official correct answer, the best answer for this question today, Manuel, is student loan debt. Student loan debt.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're going to get into this here. And like you said, props to the Heckinger Report, because we got another story from them today coming from Pete D'Amato. And President Joe Biden, congressional leaders, and debt experts are continuing to argue over student loan debt forgiveness, both how much should be canceled and which branch of government can offer the relief. Biden has balked at pushing for $50,000 of relief for student loans, for student loan borrowers, which many progressive members of Congress have been pushing for, and has instead proposed a much more modest $10,000 relief plan. Now, a majority of Americans support student loan forgiveness, but some critics have argued, perhaps disingenuously, that despite sounding good, it is a policy that would provide benefit to a group of Americans, those who've attended college, who are by default among the more privileged people in our society. Now, the Heckinger Report's analysis of federal data shows that student loan debt has ballooned over the last 2 decades, completely ballooned. In 2003, the total outstanding debt hovered around $200 billion. By 2020, that figure had grown 7 times to a total of $1.55 trillion, with new lending amounting to $100 billion each year. Now, while in general, middle and upper income households tend to borrow more in total than low income households, those with the fewest assets are actually accumulating student loan debt faster than any other group. The median student loan debt of those households has rocketed above $30,000 on average. And even if borrowers go on from college to middle-class jobs, they can still be burdened by debt and can wind up unable to build wealth because of student debt and because of other systemic inequalities like housing discrimination, right? This can be particularly compounded if borrowers, as is often the case for lower income Black and brown borrowers, tend to default more than their white and more affluent peers. Now, researchers have found that late payments and delinquencies tend to spike around $2,000, around the $2,000 level in loan balances. That might seem really low to folks, but this is likely because many of those borrowers began school but did not complete their degree program. Those knocks on a borrower's credit then have the compounding effects over time as the cost of borrowing, even renting an apartment or getting a car loan, can go up over many years. So Manuel, $1.55 trillion in student debt right now, and the president and Congress are playing hot potato with student loan debt relief. What say you, Dr. Rustin, with 3 degrees and a couple of loans in the mix?
Yeah, man, for sure. I would say cancel all student debt, like just cancel it. If the government, if the Department of Education has the power to simply wipe it away, I would say wipe it away. That number sounds like a big number, but then you think about other things that we spend money on and how big those numbers are. Hint, hint, military, hint, hint, F-35. Was it the F-35 program? That's like trillions of dollars for these warplanes. Like, let's cancel the student debt. Now, one thing about this breakdown in the Heckinger Report, they do point out that there is some truth to the notion that some middle and upper income families carry a lot of student debt, and cancellation of debt might actually benefit some affluent families. That is true. So what? Like, yes, there is that. However, there are a lot of folks who are struggling and a lot of folks who need this help and this support. And I don't want to not do it only because it might benefit some folks who don't need it. We just sent out, over the course of this pandemic, we've sent out stimulus checks to individuals, and those stimulus checks weren't enough in the first place. But a lot of folks got those checks who didn't need them. I can name some folks. I'm not going to put them on blast, like folks in my own life who received checks and definitely didn't need them. But it's okay because we know most of it is going to folks who need it. And those who don't need it, there is also the reality that money will be reinvested in the economy in some kind of way. Like folks that I know that got stimulus checks that didn't need them went out and bought stuff. That's good for business and good for the economy. So it's not just about helping out folks by canceling student debt. It's also a form of stimulus. In this Heckinger Report, this analysis didn't really get into the stimulus part of it, but there is that. Also, I mean, for the president to say he's against it because it'll go to help folks who went to Harvard and Yale and all these things, That's super whack, because just because you went to those schools doesn't mean you are affluent and that you're doing great. I mean, I am here. I went and got a Harvard master's, and guess what? The teacher pay scale does not have a Harvard bonus there. So there's a lot of folks who went to these schools and aren't like bringing in the dough because of that. So I don't like that part of it at all. Actually, two more things real quick. For those who say, well, I paid off my student debts, why should somebody else just have theirs canceled? That's like the dumbest logic ever. I mean, I lost my father to leukemia. It was a long, drawn out battle. I hope they cure that thing, and I hope nobody else has to go through that. And if they cure leukemia and some folks don't have to go through that, like my family had to go through that, I'll be so happy for them. I'm not going to sit there like, oh, y'all got it easy. Y'all just, got out of it and my family had to suffer through this. No, I will be happy for them. Even if some of the folks who were to benefit from a leukemia cure maybe are terrible people and shouldn't get that. So what? I will still be happy that they got that help, because I want to see people not be harmed and not be hurt. And the last thing I'll say is, so much of this debate focuses on the individual borrower and it's like their decision to take out loans and go to college. We got to remember that one reason why student loan debt has skyrocketed over the years is because tuition has skyrocketed, and that has a lot to do with policy decisions around supporting colleges and supporting especially our state schools. So I want to quote, I have some student loan debt that I still have to pay off for this doctorate. Part of me getting that doctorate was exposure to a lot of research, and I want to pull from that and read a brief quote from a research article that we analyzed in my doctorate program. And this comes from Financing College Opportunity by McClendon, Tanberg, and Hillman, 2014. I just want to read one line of this article. This is like a long form analysis of financial aid over the course of decades. And one bit of their research found that, I'll quote, overall, stronger Republican electoral presence at the state level is associated with higher levels of public investment in need-based student aid, but with lower levels of spending on general fund appropriations to campuses. So, translation, states that have had more Republican control of the legislature and the governor's seat have been states that have been more likely to reduce appropriations to college campuses. In other words, defund their college system. And as a result of that, those are areas where students have been more likely to rely on need-based financial aid, such as a lot of these student loans that we are talking about here. So let's not just talk about the individual borrower. This is part of a larger issue here with how we support our institutions of higher learning. Yeah.
Very well said, Manuel. It's, I feel like you made all the major points right there. I saw this week on Twitter a meme, and I forget which, white man Republican was yapping, but was talking about the student loan debt issue and saying, when I was in school, I worked a minimum wage job over the summer and I paid, my tuition, and, ostensibly casting shade on the millions of students across the country for whom that is a financial impossibility, right?
Yeah.
And it showed right below what he was saying, in 1974, the minimum wage was $3.25 an hour. Tuition at his university was $800 for the semester. In 2020, minimum wage is $7.25. Tuition is, $12,000 per semester, right?
Yeah.
And, and like that is the financial reality we're living in. This is a man-made problem. And I'm saying literally man-made because, let's be honest, this is made by mostly a bunch of men. And, this was an intentional set of choices put in place because the incentive structures in Washington actually reward folks, right? When there's greater debt, right, among the population. And the reality is this is not about work ethic. This is not about pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. This is about a system that is fundamentally unfair to students and that cripples financially, particularly folks who are not the poorest students in the country, right? Because a lot of the very poorest folks get full financial aid in a lot of cases, right? Or the amount of debt they have to take out is really small. But it's the folks who are like just above really, really impoverished, right? Up to the middle class who are having to take out huge swaths of loans. And then, of course, there's not $1 million a year salaries waiting for everyone when they graduate, right? And so this is actually further widening the gaps in terms of, wealth inequality in this country. And this was a set of choices. We can make different choices, like, as you said, abolishing student loan debt, or at least doing the $50,000. That would do a huge correction in terms of, who would be left with debt to pay off, would be more, on the spectrum of folks who've gone on to grad school and got multiple degrees, or, folks who are at the upper income earning threshold in the country and are better equipped to pay off their remaining debt and do things then like buy a house while they also pay off a smaller loan. So this is good policy. This helps the vast majority of people. And I think these attempts to say, well, this is not progressive policy, are coming from the people who don't support any progressive policy. So facts. I'm not buying it. So yeah.
Big facts, big facts. And of course, we love facts here on All of the Above. In Jeff, I think they would have easily wiped out the student loan debt. They would have canceled these loans if we weren't, as a nation, so addicted to this myth of meritocracy, this whole idea that I did it, why can't you do it? It's past time. It's past time to get rid of that. So yeah. All right, folks, that about does it for today's Do Now. Up next will be our seminar segment. Let's talk about elementary schools and this reopening pandemic learning complex situation. All right, that's coming up next. Stay tuned.
Hey folks, thanks so much for watching All the Above. We appreciate everyone who listens or watches our show. And it has been a whole year, since we had to leave the studio, come home and film remotely. And we had to build from scratch our home studios. Of course, that's not free, and we are so grateful for the support that has come from so many of you out there. If you're new to the show, you like what you hear, and you want to support, that's great. All you have to do is go to aotashow.com/support. That's aotashow.com/support. There you can donate on Venmo or on Cash App. We are at AOTA Show. Or you can go on Anchor and you can subscribe. That means a lot to us because every little bit helps. Even a few dollars a month helps us keep making this show for you. Thanks so much, folks. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
All right, folks, welcome to today's seminar. With so much going on during this pandemic education era and so many conversations and debates being had around everything from reopening to what level of student is being harmed the most through distance learning or hybrid learning, we thought it'd be prudent for us to invite a super dope elementary school teacher who is also an active member of her union to help explore some of the complexities of teaching amid all these debates around reopening and so-called learning loss and all of that. So we want to welcome to All of the Above, Miss Meghann Seril. Meghann, what up?
Hi, everyone. Nice to be with you.
Thank you so much for dropping by All of the Above. We are very excited to hear about your perspective as an elementary teacher and how your experience has been during this pandemic. But let's first give our viewers and listeners a little bit of background about your work. So Meghann Seril is a national board certified third grade teacher in the Mandarin dual language program at Broadway Elementary School in Venice, California. This is Meghann's 13th year in the classroom, where she also serves as a teacher mentor. In addition to teaching, Meghann plays an active role in her union, United Teachers Los Angeles, and has served as a chapter chair and House of Representatives member. Meghann is a Teach Plus California Senior Policy Fellow who earned her credential and master's in teaching from USC, University of Southern California. I hear that's the second best university in Los Angeles.
Oh, we're not going to start off that way, are we?
I mean, I heard that that's the case. But in any case, also, Meghann, I think we got to add to your bio that you are also, I think, officially the first elementary teacher to guest here on All of the Above. So we might want to move that up to the start of your bio, because that's pretty dope. But in any case, thank you so much for being on our show. And I'm going to toss it to Jeff with the first question.
Yeah, well, thanks, Manuel. Meghann, so excited to have you on the show today. I know we connect on Twitter, but it's nice to actually meet you in person, or as close as it gets to in person during these pandemic times. But we'd love to start with really just kind of like checking in, right? How are you and your third graders doing? And what are some of the successes or challenges that you've experienced this year? I know that especially for our younger students, distance learning has made things, shall we say, complex.
Yeah, complex is definitely a word I would use to describe this year. When I think about this year, I think about perseverance, I think about flexibility, and I think about grace that I'm trying to have with my students and their families, and that my students have really shown me in this time. Some of the challenges of being online is just the amount of time that we're in front of the screen, and so we've got to change it up a lot to keep kids engaged. Assessment is is pretty tricky because we've got kids all across the board, and so just trying to know where my students are at and then how to meet them to move them forward has become so much more complex online when you have kids in and out of Zoom meetings, when you see pets and siblings in the background. But I'm really proud of my kids because I can see that we're all doing the best that we can right now. And some of the bright spots have been getting to meet my students' siblings, having their pets in the screen with us. Sometimes right before I start my read aloud, one of my students will say, "Hang on, Miss Seril, can I grab my brother? I think he's going to want to hear this story." So we get a little bigger audience in the room, which is a lot of fun. And in this time, it's been great to get to know my kids at home. They've been sharing the magic tricks they've learned how to do, the coding games that they're making. I have kids who are singing for us and playing their instrument. And so getting to continue to celebrate them, all of their skills and talents, and try to foster that classroom community has definitely been the highlight of this experience because we get to know our students in a new way. So we're just trying to move forward each day, really focus on that classroom community so that our kids can stay engaged and connected with each other.
Lovely. That's really heartwarming. It's always great to have a student show you their pets or their little siblings, and to, as a teacher, to be virtually invited into their home. That's just a real honor for sure. So I'm glad you pointed that out as some of the bright spots. And you mentioned just trying to get through, and for your district, Los Angeles Unified, at least at the time of this recording, there's been intense debate about returning to in-person learning, and it looks like the district, like a lot of districts across California, is slowly heading towards potential reopening, at least for the younger grades, especially as more vaccines become available for educators and for teachers. So we're wondering, with the few months left in the school year, what are your hopes and aspirations for what the next few months might hold for you and your students?
I hope that when we can come back together and be in person, that it really is a celebration of getting through this year, of making it through, what is now almost 1 year of being at home in distance learning. One of my concerns about this is that the timing of returning for in-person seems to match up with the timing of standardized testing and SBAC. And what I really don't want is for students to think about returning in person with standardized testing. I just think that sends the wrong message about what we value and what's really important right now. So I'm hoping that when we go back, there is a plan to just focus on, again, recreating or strengthening that classroom community since we've been together in our own group of 24, 21. And then also recreating that school community because we have been so isolated from each other. My third graders, while they're a pretty strong group together, haven't really had a chance to interact with the two other third grade classes at my school. So I'm really hoping that there can be some opportunities for students to connect with those friends that maybe they haven't been with. One thing I did at the beginning of this calendar year in January when we started up again was to survey my students on the things that they needed or wanted as we continue distance learning. And one of the main responses I got back was, we just want time to connect and talk with each other and be together. And so if there's any way that I can provide that for my kids, I really hope that that will be a focus. And then, let's make a plan for academics. Let's not just make knee-jerk reactions about what we need to do in the last 1 or 2 months that are left. But let's plan forward for next school year so that we can really have a plan, have thought it through clearly so that our students are not harmed in this transition.
Yeah, I really appreciate your thoughts there, Meghann, and kind of framing of this issue around both the concerns about testing this spring, and then the kind of actual needs that you're seeing and that you're hearing from your students around connection, around community, around what I think many folks feel is the main thing that has been really lost with distance learning, which is the kind of human aspect of school and the student experience. So kind of building on that a little bit more, I think there's certainly lots of use now of the term and the rhetoric about learning loss. And folks saying we've got to get to the bottom of the learning loss and figure out what it is and then address it in our classrooms. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what you think that means for you and for your students, and how addressing learning loss might look in your classroom. But also, what kind of challenges do you anticipate coming up in terms of understanding, where your students are at and how to best support them? And what do you think schools need to do in order to best support elementary school students upon a return to physical school?
Yeah, the learning that we've done this year is definitely not what we would have done in the classroom, but I think there have been some positives to that. We've focused a lot this year on social and racial justice issues, and I'm really proud of my students, my kids, for the way that they've engaged in some really complex topics and thought about what they can do in their communities, and looking to other young advocates and activists. And we've learned a lot of technology skills. Man, my students are my tech support. They can troubleshoot for each other. So I think there are a lot of things that we have learned that might not seem traditional, but are still so valuable and useful for our kids. And I don't think we should lose sight of that because it wasn't exactly the same as before. And I do hope that when we go back into the classroom, we're not just thinking about going back to what it was, but we're really envisioning and reimagining what it could be. Because I think we've learned a lot. Teachers, students, parents, and we have an opportunity to change things. So why not take that opportunity? What we were doing before was not working for all of our students, definitely not working for all of our colleagues and our staff. So we need to take this opportunity. I'm really hoping that when we go back to school, we have planning time. I'm hoping that we get very clear guidance at the state level, from the federal level, from our districts, of how to move forward, so that teachers don't feel like they are left to do their own planning and thinking. And I would love to have that time actually designated and set aside, so that we're not doing it in the summer when we really need a rest. I really need a break this time around from what this year has been. So I'm just hoping that we can think clearly and slowly about going back and ramping things up. Always, of course, keeping in mind our students' safety, their social and emotional well-being, making sure they're okay first, and then getting to the academics next.
I love that. I mean, you mentioned hoping that we can think clearly and slowly about this. And I regret to inform you that clearly and slowly hasn't really been the way we've been approaching any of this. And you can look at reopenings, as you mentioned, like this knee-jerk reaction. And with the reopening debate, we see such such a fraught argument around like who's to blame and how bad are students being harmed by not being in the physical space. And this whole conversation has, at least recently, taken a turn to really, really cast the blame on teachers and teacher unions specifically. So there's, a lot of folks, there's been a lot of rallies, these so-called Open Schools Now rallies across California to push for schools to physically reopen for in-person schooling. And a lot of the folks at those rallies have been saying like, it's the teacher unions. The teacher unions are getting in the way. These kids are at home suffering, and teachers, if they really cared about student achievement, they would get back to in-person learning. So we're wondering, as somebody who's an active member of your union, and United Teachers Los Angeles is one of the unions that has been mentioned in the news a lot by those who are criticizing I guess for them slow speed of reopening schools. We're wondering how do you respond to those criticisms that teachers and their unions are the ones who are getting in the way of the type of learning that students need?
Yeah, I think it's important to first acknowledge that this is hard. It's hard for students. I know it is hard for parents. It's been really tough for teachers too. I think knowing that I'm working more hours in the day through my weekends to try to prepare lessons and activities that can be as engaging as possible for my kids. And at the same time, knowing that it's not quite enough. Is really tough. It's tough because I take pride in what I do and I want to give my kids the best. So always knowing that there could be more and we've got to continue to work toward that. It motivates me. But I also don't think it is unreasonable for teachers to expect to be safe in their workplace, not just for themselves, but for our students and for all of our families. I was trying to imagine, because we have been so fortunate to be able to work from home in this time, what it might be like to be back in the classroom with all of the students. And I was thinking to myself that it's kind of like field trip days. Field trip days for the kids are probably the best day of the year. But I know for teachers, especially for my 8 and 9-year-olds, it is the most stressful day of my year because I spend the whole day just counting heads and watching kids' bodies and making sure that they are okay and that wherever we're visiting, we're all doing okay. And it takes a lot of energy for me to be hyper vigilant about my kids. And what I don't want is when we go back to the classroom that I am spending all of my energy and attention focusing on counting masks and checking hand washing and did you touch this pencil or these materials? What I really want to focus on is my kids. Their academics, making that classroom community. So I think, expecting us to have the proper resources, proper staffing, and just to be physically safe in the classroom is absolutely a reasonable expectation. I don't think any of us want to yo-yo back and forth between classroom and home. We want to be moving forward, and to do that again, we got to think carefully. We've got to be really considerate about how we move forward so that we're not causing further harm to our kids or to our community.
Yeah. Very well said, Meghann. And that framing around it's not unreasonable for educators to want to be safe or to expect to be, have their health and safety be protected in the workplace, I think is one of these fundamental points that sometimes gets left out of the larger political debate as people, are talking about the reopening of schools, as school boards are having virtual meetings to discuss the prospect of teachers going back into the physical classroom, every day. I think I am grateful for folks like yourself who have, been able to kind of work together and elevate the point of it's not a reasonable expectation to say, well, maybe there's a 1 to 5% chance today you might contract a very dangerous, infection while at work, and that that's not actually a reasonable thing to do when we have alternatives available to us. So very much appreciate you making that point. I am wondering on that issue, though, if you might be able to speak about, especially for our youngest elementary students, I think some of the pressure to want to reopen elementary school is coming from a well-intentioned place that says, the impact of the kind of gap time in schooling for younger kids, right? Taking a year out of your time in school when you're 7 or 8 years old means something very different, or certainly something more extreme than taking a year out of school when you're 14 or 15 or 16 years old. And wondering if you can, maybe just kind of speak to that in terms of like, what are you seeing in terms of the kind of developmental impact on students that the pandemic has had?
Yeah, I think I can acknowledge that the work that we have done so far in this school year is definitely not the same amount of work that we would have done at this same time if we were together in person. We've really gone a lot more slowly with our math, focusing on depth rather than breadth, making sure our kids really understand the concepts that we're going through. When I think about the work that we're doing, um, I really just want to make sure that my kids are engaged first, that they're interested, and then try to bring in those skills and strategies that we know that they need. But I also know that kids are resilient, and kids soak up, so they soak up a lot more than you think sometimes. Sometimes I'm not sure if my kids are always listening. And then when they remind me, oh, hey, Miss Seril, that reminds me of when we talked about restorative justice, or we talked about, collective value. I can give myself a little hug that, okay, they're getting it and we're moving forward together. Um, so, there's no easy way going forward, but I think making sure that teachers have that time to connect with each other, not just within your grade level, but across grade levels, so that we know where our kids are coming from, where we need them to be getting to, is going to be really, really important. And teachers need to be given that opportunity and that time to do that planning.
Nice, nice. Yeah, well said, well said. And you know, aside from what has been probably an unimaginably difficult school year for you as an elementary teacher trying to reinvent your practice, like I know for me as a high school teacher, reinventing my practice in the midst of this pandemic has been very difficult. And I can imagine how much more difficult it would have been if the students on the other side of my screen, instead of being 17, 18-year-olds, if they were, whatever grade third graders are. I don't even know what third graders are, what, 7, 8, 9?
8 and 9, around that age.
8 and 9. Yeah, my elementary understanding is like non-existent. So I can imagine how much harder it would have been for me if I had students that young on the other side of the screen. And in the midst of all that, you have maintained and you have a long history of really being a teacher leader. Aside from mentoring, you've been a part of several endeavors and organizations that work on education policy, and you are a Teach Plus senior fellow, and you've done some work with EdSource and EdTrust West and a lot of other places, So we're wondering if you could expand on why is it important for teachers to have their voices be heard, and what would your recommendations be for teachers who are listening to this who want to make their voices heard but don't really know how to get going in that direction?
Yeah, I got involved in education advocacy around year 7 of my career. And at that time, I was feeling really good about the work I was doing in the classroom with my kids. But I also felt like there was more I could do to advocate for them and to advocate for myself and my colleagues. And so I was really fortunate at that time to get connected with different organizations, like you said, Teach Plus, Educators for Excellence, to get involved in my union. Because ultimately, there are decisions being made at all of these different levels, and we're going to be the ones to translate those decisions for our kids and their families in our classroom. And so we need to be involved in those discussions. I think some of the best ideas I've heard come from teachers when they're just, hanging out and talking about how the day is going. And we are naturally problem solvers by nature. So why not come to teachers to ask them for their best ideas going forward? I think especially now when we think about transitioning back from distance learning to hybrid or in person or whatever that next iteration is, it is really important that we take the lessons that we've learned from this time. The positives, negatives, all the good, bad, ugly in between, and use it to create something new and to create something better. I've been lucky to just be talking to others and connecting with other teachers and then learning about other opportunities to share my voice and to share my story in that way. So I would really encourage teachers to connect with others, attend conferences, get involved in your unions, because you might just be having a conversation with a person who says, hey, can you come on our show and share some of your ideas? So I think, it's just really sometimes being in the right place at the right time, but taking all of those opportunities to share your story and what you're experiencing with your kids. Because otherwise the narrative that gets told, I think, is really distorted. And I know that for all of the challenges we're experiencing, there are just so many bright spots of teachers, doing amazing things for their students, of students really, rising to this difficult challenge of distance learning. And so we need to make sure that those stories are being told as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, there you have it, folks. Meghann Seril, thank you so much for stopping by all of the above. We know your students are in great hands. You are a super dope educator, and your advocacy work for teachers, it really resonates with me as somebody who believes that classroom teachers need to be heard in these conversations, because at the end of the day, we're the ones who are interacting the most with kids, and it's very important that our voices be heard. So thank you for coming on our show and having your voice heard. And we definitely hope that the rest of your school year is a wonderful, wonderful experience for you and your students. And no matter what the reopening future holds, hopefully folks will listen to what you said about making sure that we prioritize getting that classroom community set before rushing back to testing and all these other things. So thank you again for stopping by, all of the above. All right, folks. Up next is Class Dismissed, where we give shout outs to folks doing excellent work in the world of education. Stay tuned. All right, folks, we have reached that time in the episode where we like to give shout outs to folks doing wonderful things in the world of education. Jeff, who are we shouting out today?
Oh, Manuel, I'm super, super excited for this one because not only is this a big story in the landscape of education, but also I have a personal connection to this one. So many folks, I'm sure, have heard that right at the end of February, New York City got a new chancellor. So the New York City Department of Education, which is the nation's largest school system, serving over 1 million students across the 5 boroughs of New York, now has a new chancellor. Her name is Misha Ross Porter. She is a former teacher, former principal, former superintendent and executive superintendent in the borough of the Bronx, is now the chancellor of the nation's largest school system. She is the first Black woman to hold that post. So this is a beautiful story because it happened in Black History Month, and here we are now in Women's History Month. And we have just an amazing story to tell about a Black woman who rose up through the ranks of the system, made a name for herself as just a powerful leader in the South Bronx, serving, the nation's poorest congressional district at that time, one of the most underserved, under-resourced parts of New York City, and built a school that to this day is a place that kids and families want to go. And also connected to this is the fact that once upon a time, Manuel, yours truly had the privilege of being what was then called an achievement coach for a network of schools. Shout out to the Urban Assembly. And Misha was one of the principals that I worked with. So I spent 3 years coaching with Misha, and she was just a pleasure to work with, someone I learned a ton from about school leadership. And then I had the privilege of being a principal in the same network of schools with her as well. So I think I spent something like 6 years working with Misha, and just so proud and excited for her. And of course, for the whole city of New York to have a person like Misha, who is someone who knows the work of education at the school site, who, as she said in her acceptance speech, is not going to forget, what it feels like to be a teacher, what it feels like to be a principal and a school leader in the system, and especially during these very, tricky COVID times we're still living in. So I was just so excited to see that news, right at the end of February, and to watch live her speech, and her acceptance of the position of chancellor was just amazing. So shout out to Misha, props to you. Can't wait to see all the great things you do for schools in New York City.
Yeah, so Jeff, it sounds like you got the inside track to getting her on all of the above.
Manuel, funny enough, I actually had mentioned this to you. I don't know if you remember this, like maybe a year ago, where I was like, I know this woman, she's a superintendent in the Bronx. I don't know if, she'd be willing to like make an appearance,
right,
in the media in this way, or if the district would clear that. But I was like, she'd be a real interesting guest. And in as much as maybe I could, could make that connection now, I feel like now she ain't got no time for us, man.
The system only has 1 million students in it. That's not that big of a system.
Yeah, what people fail to recognize about the New York City Department of Ed is it's bigger than the entire state school system of all but like 14 states or something, right?
Wow.
So it is a massive, massive system, even though it's very densely packed into the city. But you know what, man? Well, maybe I'll shoot an email off and see see what I can do for us. That would be great if we could get Misha on. But yeah, man, just so proud of her, proud of this kind of symbolic moment for the city of New York, my longtime former home. And yeah, man, I'm really looking forward to seeing where she goes.
Super dope. We love to see it. We love to see it. All right, folks, that about does it for this episode of All of the Above. And again, we really appreciate y'all. It's been a year. It's been quite a year. So keep hanging in there. And of course, if you enjoy what you saw or what you've listened to, please consider giving us that 5-star review. It really does go a long way. And all of our content, all of the links to all the stuff we mentioned, all that is on our website, aotashow.com. All right, we'll catch y'all next time.